Well, good morning or good afternoon for some, and welcome to today's SVDX webinar. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of SVDX, and I am delighted to have you joining us today for what will be a very interesting, I believe, conversation about board culture and effectiveness. Today's session will be 1 hour in length, and we encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A button on Zoom, and we will try our best to fold those questions into our conversation throughout today's webinar. It is truly my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel for today. I will give very brief introductions, and then I will pass it off to our moderator to kick off the webinar. Kimberly Castellano is the first Latina woman to serve on a top 10 Fortune 100 corporate board. She's a member of the board of directors of Ford Motor Company, Mutual of America Financial Group, and the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta, and is a former director of Mead Johnson Nutrition Company and Scotia Bank of Puerto Rico. Katie Hall is a director in PwC's Governance Insight Center and has over 20 years of experience at PwC, bringing significant experience in corporate governance, risk management, and governance risks and controls. Katie authors PwC governance publications, including PwC's annual Corporate Director Survey. Bonita Lonta is a public company board director, strategic advisor, and former Fortune 100 senior executive who focuses on digital innovation, AI, and sustainability. She serves on NACD's Blue Ribbon Commission on Board Culture, on the NACD World Economic Forum, CGI's Climate Advisory Council. She currently serves as an independent board director of Sunrun and True Blue. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO founder and entrepreneur and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. Many thanks to our panelists for being with us today, and thanks to all of you for joining today's webinar. Dan, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. And I think I'll highlight the fact that some of the materials we'll share, which are referenced periodically throughout the webinar, include the PwC Annual Director Survey Report, and then also the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission Report. And all of our panelists have been involved directly and indirectly in the creation of those materials, which I think serve as a great foundation. But since people can read those on their own, we'll reference it, and I'll jump in with questions and discussion. We'll try to make this conversational. I'm hoping we can get a little bit of debate and disagreement, maybe, and we'll certainly roll in questions as Nancy monitors them. I encourage people to be sending us questions. We may not get to them right away, but we'll roll them in and certainly address them at the end. But Kim, Snita, and Katie, thanks so much for taking the time. I know it's busy as we all try to cram in everything we can before the Thanksgiving break comes up. And I know you guys have all sorts of board and other obligations. So with that, let me just highlight the fact that per the description, per our conversations, board culture is often treated as a sort of soft issue. I don't think anyone in their right mind says it isn't critical and important these days, but they kind of have a squishy, feely view of it, right? And yet there's a lot of research, a lot of experience that has been kind of documented that really informs board culture. And I know that each of you believe that it can be like consciously built, sustained, change is obviously critical. I wondered as kind of a kickoff, if you might just take a minute or two to tell us, in your view, how important it is or isn't. Like it must rank somewhere, and do you think it dominates, it matters at certain times, or, you know, it's always in the top 3, or, well, it depends on the board or the company itself. So maybe just jump in and give us your sense of how critical you think board culture is, especially in today's environment. I'm happy to take volunteers, or I can do the old law professor cold call and say, Kim, I knew Kim, I was going to call on you because I knew you'd be happy with it. So welcome. Yeah, Kim, give us your thought.
Thank you, Dan, for getting me into this. I can't say no to you. You know, they talk about how board culture competes with other issues that the board is dealing with. And frankly, I think that if it is competing with other issues, then you've already failed miserably in the initial step of building board culture. Because in my opinion, board culture should be a priority in the nominating and selection process. Fit and chemistry which are essential to board culture, should be as important as qualifications, skill sets, and experience when you're looking at new director prospects. I don't know how many times confidentially I've had a CEO or a board chair or lead director come to me and tell me how disappointed they are in a specific director's sense of teamwork, sense of collegiality, working as a team, the fact that maybe they've got hidden agendas or they feel that they're not, it's not cohesive. And yet the funny thing is that same person were instrumental in bringing that director onto the board. So I think that during the nom-gov process, the process of looking for candidates, I think that too much attention is given to qualifications, experience, skill set grids, all of that fun stuff, and not enough to fit. Will that person fit with us? And so in my role on nom-gov committees, when we have a pool of candidates, when we're looking at candidates, I'm the one who's always asking, well, who knows them? Who served on a board with them, even if it's a nonprofit board? Who has seen them in action? And I don't mean not on the golf course. I mean in the boardroom, who has seen them in action?
Kim, I love that. That's a great kickoff to this entire topic. I'm going to pin a couple of follow-up questions. I don't want to tackle them now, but the most controversial one will go something like, do you think it's politically fraught to talk about fit and attitude and collegial nature in the boardroom? And I know your answer, but I'm gonna dig deeper. So be thinking about that in the back of your head, because I think sometimes, once upon a time, that concept might have been used to exclude certain people from the boardroom. But we'll come back to that. So that's just a teaser. Be thinking about that. Sunita, I wonder if you might go next with your opinion, because I'm going to have Katie weave in some tactical issues in her answer. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I would agree with what Kim said, but then maybe I'll dig a little bit deeper what it means to have a healthy and strong board culture from my experience. So agree with what Kim said. I think culture is very important, especially when you take a step back. These days, as we all know, we all experience so many new things, right? The board is faced with so many new challenges like AI disruptions, geopolitical tensions, inflation, changing stakeholder expectations. And in my opinion, having a healthy and strong board culture is a foundation so that the board can function well in order to deal with all of these new kind of challenges that we're faced. And so I guess the question then is what is a healthy board culture really, And I think when you ask board that, a lot of times board would say, oh, we have a very healthy culture, we're collegial, we work well with each other. I think those are all good. But for me, I think the crux of a healthy board culture is that boards feel enough trust, and courage, and also comfort with each other to actually engage in a healthy debate and discussions. You know what I mean? Because when you look at the spectrum of board decision making, on the one end, you can have groupthink, which value cohesiveness and collegiality, which is important. But on the other hand, you might also have disruptive disagreements, which you don't want. At the end of the day, you want to aim for this kind of optimal middle ground where you have a constructive consensus. Might not be a full consensus, but you have really feel comfortable to debate all the tough issues in order to get to a more informed decision.
That's great. And so just kind of giving some signposts here. So Kim and Sina, you both agree that it is a false framing sometimes to say that you have to compete for time by attending to board culture. It sounds like in the best of all worlds, a high-performing board is one that has a culture that has the components you just described, and that's sort of facilitative, right? So if you have trust, if you have fit, if you have collegiality, when the hard things hit, you're not competing for time, you're actually facilitating the job's function. It should work better. And so with that in mind, though, I think it is generally understood that it does take some time to both recognize what the board culture is, to decide where you want to go, and then work towards going there. And with Kim's point in mind, which is it really is about who you put on the board, obviously, and you should spend time with that. But even beyond that, I wonder, Katie, can you tell us how, kind of as a tactical matter, boards, when they do it well, they manage to fit in the time to think about their board culture, assess their board culture, decide where they want to go, and then make good selections and reinforcements? Like, how tactically do boards do that when they do it well?
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say, I agree with everything that's been said so far. Board culture is critical and foundational to an effective board. That's just simply put. So in terms of being tactical about it, very few boards have an agenda item or on the committee or the full board that says board culture. It's not something that's going to be maybe directly talked about, but indirectly it is showing up, and it's going to be things like the assessment, which in and of itself, I mean, that's probably a whole discussion whether that's an effective way to measure it, because directors tell us that it's sometimes hard to be frank. But that assessment process, particularly at the individual director level, and particularly then when you're bringing in an outside facilitator every few years to do it, that's one way that you can draw out some of those culture issues if you have the right questions in there and the right structure and process around it, including follow-up by the lead independent director or the board chair. So that's one way. Another way is tackling it as part of the annual offsite. You're together for 2 years. You've got a packed 2 days, and you've got a packed agenda, and you've got so many things to go through, strategy, etc. But having time, whether it's just putting in social time where you're getting to relate to your board members individually, that's critical. It could also look like a facilitated session. So those are just a couple of ways to think about it. But I agree, just going back to Kim's point, the onboarding, the recruiting and onboarding process is really how you get ahead of it to begin with, by thinking about who you are bringing on, not just looking at their CV and experience, but thinking about how will they interact and engage with everybody else on the board, and are we asking the right questions in this interview process, and maybe even posing behavioral or situational, here's the situation you might face as a director. How would you handle this? So just a few thoughts.
That's great. I want to follow up on something you just said, because it sounds a lot like what you would use as a best practice for hiring senior executives. And that is, you just, you said, hey, ask a situational question in the interview. Make sure you engage in a full round robin socialization. Make sure that people, so tell me a little bit more about that. Do you think it is an emergent or actual best practice to really, on average, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say on average, board selection has been a little bit less like rigorous executive selection and a little bit more like social norming and connectedness selection. And so, would you be willing to kind of double down on the whole, treat this person like it's not, of course, like a hire that's critical? Maybe expand on that. I'd invite Kim and Sunita to maybe chime in, because you've been doing this long enough that you've probably seen an arc in the pattern in terms of what's the differences. But Katie, maybe you go first on that.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to share what I think from my perspective, and then Ken and Sunita as directors in the boardroom, tell me if I'm off. I don't see this as a common practice right now. I think it's emerging. I think some boards do it really well. And that's, as I said, in the interview process, not looking at the traditional sort of board composition calculus and just looking at the CV and who knows who and that sort of thing, but posing those situational types of questions. And on top of that, bringing in, and Kim, I'll be interested to hear what you say about this, bringing in directors outside of just NomGov to be part of that interview process. So to see how that individual fits with the broader board as well.
Great. So Kim, maybe you react to that, and Sunita, you can chime in.
Well, I'll react with two thoughts. Number one, you're right, Katie. Many times those director prospects have not come in through formal processes, but through people sitting around the table saying, hey, I know this person. And then very often a executive search firm will validate that person's background, qualifications, etc. It's interesting, when Enron happened and all the other, associated scandals, and Sarbanes-Oxley came to be, the pendulum went to one extreme direction, which was, we need independent directors. They shouldn't even know each other. They should be, this old boys club doesn't work. We can't get all, the people who play golf together or belong to country clubs together. And you got to a point where not one member on a board knew each other directly or indirectly. I think now the pendulum has come back to a more moderate point of view, which is independence is extremely important, but at the same time, we don't need to all be strangers, entirely strangers to each other. And I think that's very constructive, because I don't think, one extreme or the other is just not good.
Kim, your path to the boardroom, and as a very seasoned, successful executive and entrepreneur, including YPO membership when you were younger, you've earned the right to make that statement. But that's a statement that I think some people would be nervous making out loud. So I'm glad you've made it, which is to say all strangers on a board don't make for a great performance, high-performing team. And on the other hand, I think it's clear what you're saying. We don't want to go back to let's just work off the golf buddy list of the CEO, right? So there is some in between. And I wonder, Sunita, maybe you can please react to Katie's comment generally, but I wonder if you could add what you've seen in your board work about how to strike that right balance, right? So Kim's describing a balance, and I think that, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, totally. I think asking some of the more situational questions are important. And also, I think involving maybe after this candidate has met with the nom-gov committee members, some boards also let the of course, the strong, the most likely candidate to also meet with the rest of the board so that they get a feel. But I think some other questions you can ask to kind of dig deeper with regards to this person's values, maybe, and also communication styles during the conversations, such as, like what is truly important for you. Like I remember actually on one of my boards last year, we just we were in the process of getting a new board member. And during the conversations, one of my colleagues asked the person, what is actually important for you? Like, who are you as a person? Because, this person has passed all the kind of skills, sitting CEO, all the transformation experience and all that. But to really understand this person's values and what drives and motivates this person as an individual. And also, I think to the extent possible, try to find out, I think Kim mentioned this in the beginning, try to find out from other people who may know this person in other settings to kind of find out what the communication style of this person is like, and see whether that fit within the board. Because we all know, like some boards probably are more direct, other boards are a little bit more diplomatic, and a lot of the communication style, I think, depend on the chair or the CEO. And I feel like, finding someone whose communication styles can fit the style of the board is also important in order to make that person productive.
Great. We've received a few questions. I want to highlight, there's one about the chair's impact on board culture, but we're going to get to that in a minute. So we'll definitely tackle that. And we might come back around to the red flags for a family-owned, privately held company. Only half joking, I would say that's the red flag, that it's a privately held family-owned company, right? Like that's a tough situation. So we'll come back to that if we have a few minutes. But there's a very pointed question before we move off of selection of board members, which made sense to start. Like, I think the thesis is the board members matter most of all for board culture. And it's a very pointed question, and it has to do with this balance. So, says the question, if no one on the board has any connection or knowledge of this person directly, do you drop them as a candidate? I won't comment. I'm just going to ask you, what's your answers to that? Any of you can chime in, or all of you. What do you think?
Well, one thing, we've had a few cases on different boards I've been on of that. And what I look for is clippings, media coverage of the person, interviews, because sometimes you can get a little bit of what Sunita was saying about, what drives you as a person, what are your values, what's important to you. If this person has been featured in the news, which a lot of board candidates that we'd be looking at would have, even if it's in, regional media of some type, you can get a little bit of an idea of what makes them tick. And I definitely would not eliminate somebody because of that.
Yeah, Kim, your point is with a little bit of effort, you can engage in steps to get to know that person in a way that's very meaningful. And I like that idea, right? Media is very revealing. In fact, I don't know anybody who doesn't do anything even remotely professional that doesn't have at least 10 or 20 minutes of YouTube clips of them knowingly or unknowingly, right? So I think that makes a lot of sense. And you would not eliminate them because that's kind of back to that old position of the pendulum. You know, that's maybe the wrong direction. Sunita, Katie, what do you guys think?
Totally agree. And then actually, sometimes I think when you dig deeper, you will actually find a connection somehow to that person. So that 6 degree of separation, I think is so true. You know, like it might not be like a direct connection that a current board member know this person, but you know, you dig a little bit deeper, you know, like second degree connection might know this person. You know what I mean? So in addition to what Kim said, I definitely will not drop someone just because you know what I mean, you don't know them or like your fellow board members don't know them, but look at their media coverage, look at, you know, some of their actions in the past. You know, a lot of these people, you know, some of their actions are kind of known publicly. And third, I think dig a little bit deeper into the network, and then you would find, I think most of the time there is a connection to this person.
Great. Kim, anything to add on that? Or sorry, Katie, apologies.
Sorry. No, I was just going to underscore as part of the due diligence that you're doing anyways, whether it's through a recruiting firm or on your own, you should be asking some of these questions, these great points that Kim and Sunita have brought up. So.
And it maybe goes without saying, but one of the modern challenges for boards is that to both simultaneously embrace a diverse set of director potential and to address these issues of knowing and trusting each other, it just takes time. You have to take time to dig deeper. You have to take time to find the person who does know them so you can get a direct or backdoor reference. You have to take time perhaps to socialize them. I like that point as we move off this topic, which is COVID really did us a disservice. Like, that it was hard to do a session where the person came in, maybe you had a meal or a reception in which they interacted. And these are all such practical things about not whether they're good or bad or great or fantastic, but whether there's fit, right? Coming back to Kim's first point, whether there's fit in a particular environment with a particular type of board with certain characters. On some boards, my observation has been you can have one of a particular type of personality and it's great. But if you have two, sometimes that doesn't work. And that's about fit, right? And you can make that call when you see it. I want to move off of that for a minute and just go into the kind of practical, observable tactics and tangible processes that you think constitute great board culture. And I know this isn't an exhaustive list, and some of these sometimes are even mutually exclusive, but I'm talking about things like how boards treat their materials, what the expectations and norms are, how meetings run, and how long, how not long, how do you manage involving everybody or keeping people's comments limited to not, so those kinds of things. And I'm going to call on you first, Kim, just because I know you've been in lots of different kinds of boardrooms, the very, very, very large entities, and even a nimble but effective nonprofit. So what are some things you think
on me, because I'm basically a nerd also. So
yes, and I suspect you might even cite data for us, but I don't know. So give us a couple of maybe one or two things about what boards do, maybe in the boardroom or beforehand, that you think constitutes best practices that advance culture.
I'm going to focus on two areas: pre-reads and structure of the agenda. And I'm going to put lead director or, independent chair on the back burner, because hopefully we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
With regard to pre-reads, I think it's really, really important that the pre-reads have substance to them. And substance means not just good news. So I insist that pre-reads have highlights and lowlights, and I want to see them both. I also think it's very effective in pre-reads to be very clear what you're going to put in the body of the meeting materials, the actual materials that will be discussed in the board meeting, versus what you're going to push to an appendix or a consent agenda, which your directors need to have looked at. And they can ask questions on that, but they won't be discussed in the same level of detail. And one of my pet peeves is that, I will not be on a board where there's not some sort of executive summary at the beginning of each section of each of the agenda. And that executive summary, like I said, highlights, lowlights, and something that I ask each manager, the presenter who is going to be presenting on that topic, to do is have a slide of what keeps me up at night. And it sounds, very cliche, but I love to hear, what are you worried about? Then with regard to structure, too often I think boards feel that they have to fill every minute of their agenda with some topic. And to me, there's nothing more valuable than open discussion, because in open discussion, that's when you can really get into constructive, strategic conversations. And it's great when that open discussion sometimes leaves out the managers and just focuses on your CEO and your, independent chair or executive chair, but CEO and chair. So I think that don't underestimate the importance of putting open discussion as an agenda item.
That makes great sense. And before we move on, I want to get other points on this. I should say, Kim, that if you have a list of demands that are what you would require in order to serve on a board, those probably are a really helpful list for like just best practices. Like unlike analogizing to the green room of like rock stars and the like, I've run across a stage manager who said, that rock star, their list of requirements just became our best practice. Now that other guy, he only wanted blue M&Ms and a purple dyed rose and 3 chairs that had only 2 wheels. But your list, I suspect, and we may come back to that, is a really good one. And I'd be very interested to know what it was. And you gave us 2 items and we'll maybe expand on it. But Sunita, I wonder if you could, expand a little bit on other areas and things that you don't feel obligated on this, but how boards run, like how they are inclusive at the committee. There's some really tactical stuff, like can non-committee members, do they sit on those committee meetings? Do they get priority when they ask questions? What if a board member doesn't seem to have read the pre-reads? How does the chair, or how do you handle it? Like all those little things. Can you pick a few of those maybe to point out to us?
Yeah. So then before I go to committees, I just want to really kind of like point out that actually on one of my boards, we recently modified the way meetings are run. Because, a lot of the board members and even management felt like, during board meetings, too much materials, too much presentation, don't have enough time to discuss the key issues. So we transitioned into all materials were pre-read. And in the pre-read materials, the CEO would usually share like an 8 to 10 page memo. And she would also share the key issues that they want to be discussed during board meetings. Of course, they shared all the accomplishments, but most of the board meetings would then be focused on key issues. And then we also had like a kind of dinner with just the CEO and the board members the night before. And I think that also really helped to focus kind of like the discussions the next day. And of course, after the meeting, have, executive sessions first with the CEO and then without the CEO. So just really driving home the point of what Kim said, that, we found after we modified, our board kind of meetings that way, the discussions become much more robust and much more meaningful. But I think this is also part of the culture because, in order to do this successfully, management and the CEO has to feel comfortable about this because sometimes, there's a tendency, I think, for management to only want to share like, well, they've prepared all these materials, they want to tell you all the good things. But I think it takes a certain trust and just comfort, for management to like, these are all the read them all, and these are the things we want to discuss during board meetings. And then I think to answer your questions about committees, I think it's the same thing. I think the chair of the committee has a lot of power with regards to determining kind of like what agenda being put on the committee meetings, which discussions we should focus on. Let's say if there is something very important, perhaps like the chair of the committee can move that discussion ahead, of the meeting time, and then leave the rest for operational reviews as needed. And also, I think committee chair, just like the board chair, can be more intentional in facilitating some of the maybe quieter board members to voice his or her opinion. So, chair of the board, committee chairs have a lot of power, I would have to say, in order to facilitate discussions.
That's great. I want to recap what's one clear theme, and that is that the summary, review, here's what's happened, the updating is really something that board members can take care of themselves before the precious time of the meeting, either by doing the readings, reading the executive summary, et cetera. And you're reserving that meeting time for focusing on the most critical issues. And one maybe counterintuitive critical strategy to do that is to leave some open-ended time, right, between you and the CEO, as Kim highlighted. So that's I think that's really a best practice, but it's been escalating over the last many years, where if all that's happening is your senior management is walking through a PowerPoint that's already in your board book, and that's what you're doing, you are just not using your board time correctly, and it is not the right way to go. And I'm hearing that from both of you, and that brings me kind of to you, Katie, which is what other maybe one or two items, and I know we could spend 2 hours on all this, but like one or two tactical behavioral items have you seen that distinguish boards, and you say, oh, they do this thing, isn't that great, and it's indicative of great culture?
Yeah, and just maybe I agree. We could spend all day talking about this. Part of my role in the Governance Center is looking at board materials and pre-reads and going through them and giving suggestions on all of these things. One other item to think about with the agenda is thinking about switching up the order according to risk, critical topic, whatever it is. You don't have to do the thing that you've always done for so long, because we all know what happens to the items that are last on the agenda. They get crunched and there's not enough time. So I'll leave that there. Another thing, and Sunita was just mentioning this, making sure that the discussion is facilitated in a way, generally by the board chair or the lead independent director, in a way that everyone gets a chance to speak. And maybe it's not practical that everyone speaks on every single item, but the critical topics, and we'll talk about this, but making sure that there's a psychologically safe environment, meaning that directors feel comfortable voicing dissent or maybe questioning the status quo. That's huge. And there are ways you can do that. You can assign a devil's advocate, somebody who is always for that particular issue, going to challenge. Making sure that the newest board members go first, not those who have been around the longest. Those are just some of the things that you can think about in terms of facilitating the discussion to lead to a better board culture.
No, I think that's great. Without naming the name of this shareholder activist, I will say it's a shareholder activist that's been around for a long time and is generally, insofar as this is possible, relatively well liked. And he said to me, 80% of the value that we bring and the changes we make is we reordered the board book and we changed the way people can speak. And I'm like, you got to be kidding. And this is about 10 years ago. He's like, no, seriously, that's about the most that I can do. I'm like, well, I should be a shareholder activist. That sounds pretty easy. He's like, no, there's some harder parts. But it's an interesting point you make, which is putting the things that you really need to get to first, eliminating the, let's update you about things everyone knows and everyone read, and then further really enticing. If you have someone on the board, they're on the board for a reason. Try to pull out of them their opportunity to contribute, because we all have different personalities. So I think those are all great tactics. We might come back if there's some more questions about it, but I do want to switch to a one-side question, which sounds small, but I know for some boards it's very big. And then I want to talk about chairs. So the side question is the following. A lot happens between board meetings, and boards, I think, not good or bad culture, but have very different cultures about how to handle that. And so sometimes it's the chair, they handpick a few people. Maybe there's a quasi or a formal executive committee every once in a while who then has intermediate, discussions so that they're kind of queuing stuff up for the board meeting. They might be the ones who declare that they need an actual intermediate board meeting before the other board meeting. But this idea of having directors formally and informally talk to each other between board meetings, sometimes about substance, sometimes not about substance. Can you comment on that? It seems like, on the one hand, a really good thing if you want boards to get to know each other and trust each other. But on the other hand, it can also create problems, because you can end up with like an inadvertent cabal of like 5 secret power directors who kind of talk between meetings. So whoever would like to volunteer, talk to me about the pros and cons and how to manage that. I see, Sunita, you're leaning in the most, so you're going to go first. You're chomping.
Okay, well, yeah. So Dan, I'll answer this question, I think, in 2 parts. So
Okay.
The first part, I think, is about the importance of building that genuine person-to-person relationship, so that you have rapport, trust, respect, right? So I think that's important. I think board members, they should meet for coffees, for lunch, for dinners outside of board meetings, more to build that person-to-person relationship. I think the second part of the discussion, which I think sometimes happen inadvertently, as you said, maybe you have a chair of the board who has been there for a long time. Perhaps he or she was a former CEO, have access to some material information with the management team that other board members may not have. Maybe he or she knows 2 other board members that have been serving for a long time. So inadvertently, the 3 of them could be talking about something in the material, but not, let's say, informing the others. I think that's very dangerous. And when I've seen this happen, I don't think anyone advertently means to like exclude other board members. This all happened inadvertently, I guess. But you have to be very conscious that I think decisions should be made inside the boardroom with all board members having an awareness of what's going on and having access to the same material information. So that's kind of like my opinion about that. Sure, maybe the 3 people can inadvertently talk to each other, but then the chair should like inform the others, hey, there is this situation going on. Should we get together as a group, instead of just these 3 people predetermine the outcome and then go to the board meeting with this predetermined kind of decision.
That's great. And let me tease that out. So on the one hand, these between meeting interactions that are social for purposes of building relationships, getting to know each other, that seems very positive and very consistent with all that we've talked about. But you have to be pretty disciplined not to, especially if you somehow are in the know, not to accidentally slip into a subset of directors knowing more in advance in a way that isn't, appropriate. And, one observation, I've seen some boards tackle this pretty effectively. Just saying that out loud, right? Like saying, listen, we want to avoid having subgroups discuss material items. There's legal reasons too, but set aside the legal reasons. We just don't want that culture. And so saying it out loud, but also things do happen. And I've seen some boards with the chair and the CEO together, or if they're the same person, writing an in between board meeting memo, just saying, hey, these are some things that are happening. This is some stuff that I think will be on the board. I just want you all informed. It just so happens that director so-and-so and I bumped into each other at lunch, and we mentioned this last Tuesday, but now you all know, here's some interesting stuff, just FYI. So Kim, I see you nodding. That and other strategies, what other things can you deploy to make sure you manage that well?
Well, I think an excellent suggestion is that the CEO have update memos. And I'm not talking about PowerPoint presentations, but update memos, and in the months that you're not meeting as a board. And frankly, I know a CEO who's fantastic. As part of our pre-read is his whole memo of what he thinks is important, what he's been working on, what's worrying him. And it's not, again, not in PowerPoint format. This is an actual prose memo, and the prose gives you substance that you don't necessarily get from a PowerPoint. And that helps a lot with what you were saying, Dan, which is you don't want to have a subset of directors knowing things in between meetings that others don't know. This way they all know them. Also, I think another best practice is the CEO twice a year having a one-to-one telephone call with each director. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what's worrying you. Tell me what you think I should be focusing on. One-to-one with each director. It's impossible to prevent communication outside of the boardroom. And sometimes that communication may slip into, business conversations. So I think that, frankly, if you have a CEO who is paranoid about that, you have a problem. And one of the biggest reasons for downfall of CEOs that I've seen is when they're insecure or when they have ego issues. So I think that, it's going to, if you have a strong board culture, that will be a foundation for not being paranoid about communication between directors outside of the boardroom, whether it's social to build chemistry and rapport, or whether it occasionally slips into business conversation. But the good thing about monthly updates is that business conversation is going to be all with the same level of information.
That's great. I want to make sure we keep moving because I promised to try to adhere to the best practice of ending 5 minutes before the hour. I've yet to successfully do it, but this is going to be the webinar in which I do it. And so we have 15 minutes left. I wonder, I want to roll in the chair kind of concept, but also I think it might make sense to lay the groundwork. Katie, I'm going to call on you. about these kind of the behavioral science stuff that we've come to know. And maybe you can distill that, because I think a segue from that is going to be about chair impact, by the way. So maybe you can take just a minute to tell us the foundation of the behavioral science that we're now using to name the things that Kim and Sunita and others are talking about on these boards. Like, people intuitively know it, but maybe expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the past year, a few of us in our group have really focused and honed in on board culture and the social science behind it. And, these are not terms that we made up. They're social science. It's out there for anybody to read about, but there are 4 that we think really have an impact on boardroom dynamics. The first is threat rigidity. It just simply means it's the tendency for a person or a group of people in a boardroom to become more rigid and less flexible as external threats and pressures mount. So think about a shareholder activist scenario or a cyber breach. Do you tend to sort of follow the established norms, not rock the boat, defer to the leader? That's threat rigidity. Escalation of commitment. This is sort of classically throwing good after bad. So you've made a decision, maybe it's an acquisition, and the due diligence is showing you that this wasn't a great decision. Having the ability to reverse course and admit to a mistake, not something that comes easily. Generally, people just continue to follow the path and justify their behaviors. Next is, and those 2 are ones that you want to minimize. You want to minimize threat rigidity and escalation of commitment. You want to boost collective intelligence. So simply put, you've got this high-performing team as a board of really seasoned executives and professionals and those who are at the height of their careers. You want to take advantage of all of their collective knowledge and put it to work in the best way for the board. And that doesn't necessarily always happen when you have 10 of the smartest people around the room. You have to sort of make sure that they're engaging in the right way. And back to the conversation about fit and thinking about that in the recruiting process. And the last is psychological safety. We talked about that earlier. That one, I think, gets thrown around a lot. And that's just having the ability to voice your thoughts and opinions and not be reprimanded for that. And there's definitely some tactical ways you can get around those, but those are the 4 sort of main behavioral sort of challenges or things to think about in terms of board dynamics.
Those are great. Yeah. I mean, the first 2 I've often heard is summarized as hunkering down and doubling down, right? Like, so when things get tough, you're like, do it the way we've always done it. And then if you made a mistake, you're like, I'm going even harder, right? So, and then the other 2 make sense. So here's my segue question to chairs. Chairs, obviously, and whether it's a CEO chair or maybe a lead director, independent chair in a kind of more classic example that's different from the CEO, they obviously matter. How can they not? But, maybe you can identify, any of you, the ways, either relying on these 4 points, because I think chairs enable or disable these, but also just generally, what impact do chairs have? And maybe what are 1 or 2 things that you've observed great chairs that foster great culture that they do or don't do, maybe? And Kim, I'm going to have you go first, because you might segue from some of your kind of 4 behavioral aspects, or pick whatever you like, and then we'll kind of just go around.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some practices that I believe are best practices, because I've noticed them from experience present in exceptional chairs or lead directors. The first best practice would be that the executive session is divided into several discussions or sessions with different attendees. So it'll start off with everyone in the room, meaning all the directors, plus the CEO and chair, if the chair is not independent. And then the CEO will leave and you'll talk to the chair. And then the chair will leave and you'll talk to any non-independent directors. And then those will leave, and then you're left with just the independent directors. And that's when then the second best practice, in my opinion, is that the lead director won't say, does anybody have anything to say? He will or she will go around the room one by one and ask them, what was your opinion of this meeting? What worked? What didn't work? What would you feel that we need to do more of a deep dive into? What are the issues that are concerning you? But every single person will speak. And then the third best practice is that when this lead director or independent chair speaks with the CEO, we receive a written email. This was the result of the conversation. We discussed this, and this is what they said. We discussed this, and this is what we said. And that is fantastic, because he or she reports back to you as a director, and you really know where you stand. You really know the receptiveness of the CEO. You really know if the CEO had some concerns when the lead director raised concerns. So I think those 3 steps during the executive session help make for an exceptional lead director.
That's great. And I have to admit, I take notes during the sessions, mainly to facilitate conversation. I don't very often take notes as like, make a note of this. I just made a note of all the things you just said. I think that's a really great point. And maybe Cindy, you can expand on that. And because every board's a little bit different, and sometimes there's different configurations. If you like, Federal Home Loan Bank System has, depending, true independent directors in some cases who are chairs, and the CEO isn't on the board, which is a weird configuration. And there's a lot of variety. But Sunita, can you expand on that? And by the way, thank you, Kim, for answering the executive session question, which we might expand a little bit on, that was embedded in the participant. So Sunita, go ahead.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's interesting, Dan, because even in the NACD study of board culture, we talk about, while ensuring a healthy board culture is the responsibility of every board member, the chair or the lead independent director really a lot of time act as the primary culture carrier of the board, right? Because he or she should not only model, the behavior that you want, but also reinforce it. You know what I mean? So let's talk about situations where there might be some problematic board members, because Kim already shared a lot of the kind of best practices with regards to ensuring inclusiveness, ensuring, robust discussions and all that. But let's say there is a problematic board member. A lot of times, assuming the problematic board member is not the chair, usually, someone will go to the chair to ask him or her to help facilitate, discussions or talk to the person. And I think a strong chair would view this as an opportunity to, again, reinforce and address some of the, let's just call it cultural red flags that might be going on the board. And, this can be something simple as like someone who maybe talk too much on things that maybe not as relevant, or someone who has a tendency to want to manage instead of govern or oversee, But as a board chair, usually that is the person who should have the courage to speak, to the problematic director, of course, in private, but, to address some of the cultural red flags that can, I guess, be an impediment to having a healthy and strong board culture.
And this is a common theme, which is board members generally, but certainly chairs, need to be quite practiced and comfortable at difficult conversations, right? That's never not a difficult conversation, even if it's meant constructively, even if held in private, etc. I know empirically, a lot of boards have simply let poor performing directors be untouched, and eventually they'll either go away, they'll mandatorily retire, and that seems like not a best practice. And this is a nice segue to the last topic that I really do want to dig into in our last 6 minutes, and we've managed to answer most of the questions. We won't get to private equity questions. It deserves its own webinar, which we will try to schedule in the near future. But here's the segue of the question, which is board performance, board evaluations, right? So this has been a hot topic for like a decade, which means it's just a perpetual hot topic. Kim, I wonder if you might, or Katie rather, I wonder if you might kick us off with what we're supposed to be doing. What's the best practice? And then I'd like maybe, some practical insights about what you've seen from any of you, what you've seen work and what you think maybe doesn't work as well. So Katie, you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. I'll talk through maybe what the textbook to answer would be, just so we know how an effective assessment works, and then we can talk about what the reality is. So generally, you have your board and your committee assessments. You'd want to have an individual or peer-to-peer assessment. I would say about less than half of S&P 500 companies now perform individual assessments. That number is growing, but it's still not widespread. And I mentioned it earlier, but having those performed, and then maybe every few years having an outside facilitator come in to do that. So that would be, and that, you're going to have questions that are not just yes, no questions. They're going to have behavioral type questions that get at some of the social science behaviors I talked about. And most importantly, the lead independent director or board chair is going to take whatever comes from that and then have those difficult conversations. So that's a perfect world. And I'm sure I'm leaving some things out. That's how it would work. Where I see it fall down is the questions that are asked become, very repetitive and maybe aren't getting at the right, aren't getting at the behaviors that are problematic. And to the follow-up part, you just talked about it, Dan. We include this in our survey. Directors tell us it's really hard to have an awkward conversation. Or it's really awkward to have a hard, conversation either way. And these are seasoned professionals who have, spent their careers at the top of organizations, and it's hard for them. So those are two places that where I see it fall down. I'm sure Kim and Cindy have some good insights.
Yeah, and I wonder, Kim and Cindy, in the interest of time, could you give us one or two things that you think really help a board do better evaluations, or things they shouldn't do, in your opinion? And then I am going to ask our very last question, which is, what should people listening do today? Like, what change should they make? So maybe, Sunita, you go first on this one about board evaluations. Any suggestions about how to make them better?
Sure. Yeah, I found actually this facilitation by third party really helps. And I think, when we do board evaluation, it should be both like the written format, but also the one-on-one conversations, because you can tee up a lot of the sensitive issues or the dynamics from the one-on-one conversations. However, as I think Katie already mentioned, not all boards are comfortable with individual assessments. However, formally at least, but however, there are things that, let's say the lead independent director or the chair of the NomGov committee can start doing to kind of like softly introduce kind of like a concept of like individual assessment. You can start asking questions such as, what do you think? So what do you like about so-and-so style or contributions or thoughts? What do you think so-and-so can improve? Just like something soft, just to kind of start the conversation. Because at the end of the day, I think boards should be courageous enough to have individual assessment. But I know that many boards, they do the group self-assessment, but many are still uncomfortable in doing kind of like that individual assessments.
That's very helpful. Kim, anything to add?
Yeah, I really think assessments are a double-edged sword. You have three kinds of assessments. You have the token ones, which are superficial and provide not much insight. And then you have what I call constructive and destructive ones. And boy, is it a fine line to walk between them. I think it's very constructive to get into the nitty-gritty of agenda, timing, functionality of the board and the committees, especially when you provide, room for qualitative feedback. I think all of that is very constructive. Where it starts getting sticky is obviously when you're rating your lead director, you're rating your committee chairs, you're looking at each other. Imagine how destructive it can be to create an atmosphere where directors are essentially graded, where they're competing against each other. And frankly, I haven't run across in one board a truly constructive peer-to-peer assessment. It's softened a little bit when it's one-on-one privately, and not necessarily in writing. But boy, I don't think we've hit a home run on or perfected that process.
Let me, since Kim and I, you and I have had the benefit of having been on panels and talking separately, let me consolidate that answer, because for some it might strike them as either fatalistic or too concerned. But here's my sense of your view, and that is the chair and other leaders play a role in the soft intervention and coaching and helping of other directors to do better. That's always ongoing. That you're not saying that's a negative thing, and then the formalistic evaluations can really go into the blocking and tackling, which I think we've just discussed, really do matter, like how the materials, like how things run. And then you're pointing out that it is truly fraught. If you take that evaluation, if you couldn't solve it between chair and director, or between NomGov chair and director, and the soft, interactions that help people do better, if you couldn't solve it there, and the way you run things didn't solve it, then boy, we have yet to find a way that really solves it, that doesn't run the risk of blowing stuff up, making people adverse. I think that's a very practical, realistic view. And I will admit, if you asked me 20 years ago, I would have been much more textbook academic and said, oh, Kim, you just need to hire an outside counsel and have a lawyer. It'll be privileged, make it verbal, do a round robin. Fast forward to now, and I would say, I'm with Kim, I think, on this overall, like having actually experienced it. So with that, what I want to do now is have you each in 30 seconds or less just tell this group, if you didn't listen to anything, I hope people did, but if you didn't listen to anything, here's one thing to either think about or do in the next 48 hours as a director that will improve or enlighten you about board culture. So I'm going to go in kind of reverse order. I'm going to do Katie, Sunita, and then we'll wrap up with Kim. So Katie, is there one thing people should do or think about, and what would it be?
Sure. I'm going to break the rule though, not 48 hours. I would say at your next board meeting, as you're prepping for your next board cycle, step back with fresh eyes, look at the board materials, look at the agenda, and sit and look at the meeting and watch your fellow directors speak. What do you notice that maybe isn't working, that we're all just so busy and heads down in that we kind of take for granted? That's just the way things have always been. So fresh eyes.
I love it. That's great. Thank you. So Anita.
Sure, yeah. I guess since I'm one of the commissioners for the NACD Blue Ribbon Study on board culture, I would highly recommend people to download the report. If you don't have time to read the whole report, there's a summary. I think it gives really practical frameworks, recommendations, and tools for you to consciously build and maintain a strong and healthy board culture.
I'd like to give an upvote for the Blue Ribbon Commission reports in general for the NACD, but this one in particular, I like essential reading. I have a list of like 12 things every new director must read. This is now on, it used to be 11. This is now on that list. So thank you for that. Kim, you get final word.
When a company's under stress, whether it's financial distress, industry disruption, that's when the true colors of your board directors are going to come through. And that's when you're really going to find out just how strong that board culture is. Remember that. Remember that the tough times are going to be when you really know whether that director cares more about that company or is only concerned with ensuring that their personal reputation doesn't suffer. So make sure to, in that interview process, which we spoke about, that pre-screening process, talk to them about whether they've had a really, really tough time in their career and how they felt about it.
That's fantastic. All right. With that, we didn't quite finish with the 5-minute buffer, but we've got 2.5 minutes. I just want to thank Kim and Sunita and Katie for taking the time and for your organizations to support the time you took to help us. We really appreciate it. This was great. And we look forward to talking to you guys again for sure. We'll do a regroup at some point in time on some of these topics. And thanks everyone for spending the time with us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.